Good morning. My name is Mariko Takeuchi. I am moderating the panel for the next 45 minutes. I come to you from a background of design strategy, human-centered design, particularly in the developing world. Until recently, was running, founding, and building up a social innovation lab based in Cambodia. And more recently have been working with the South African presidency to redesign their basic education system through an innovation lab approach. But enough about me. I'd like to introduce you to our panel. I am joined by Derek Miller, Director of the Policy Lab in the US, Shariha Khalid of the Scope Group, Malaysia, also Matt Klein, the Executive Director of the Center for Economic Opportunity, and also Samir Doshi, Science, Technology, and Innovation Advisor at USAID Global Development Lab. But before we start, just a quick overview. Our panel has gone a little bit rogue versus the ones this morning. We're going to change up the format a little bit. Less heavy on presentations, and we'll dive straight into a discussion. And I ask that all of you here listen without too much judgment, because I have encouraged all of our panelists to be very frank, to be very candid, and to focus more about learnings, failures, as opposed to talking just about successes. And so we've also encouraged them to debate and to discuss candidly. So please don't judge as we get into, hopefully, an insightful discussion. So with that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And in doing so, please focus on two questions. First, what is your method to poverty alleviation? And what is it that makes it so effective? And secondly, how is it different from what's been done to date? So over to you, Samir.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I had a nice welcome back. I'm actually on leave. I teach at the University of Cambridge, and I had a good little immigration fiasco returning back yesterday. So it's nice to be here. No, it is really exciting. So as Mariko said, I work for the U.S. government's Agency for International Development. It is our foreign assistance arm, and to kind of see all the different creativity, innovation, experimentation, risk-taking, and enthusiasm, I should also add, around a variety of different topics is really kind of great to witness and absorb, and I hope to engage in much more. So I work at the Global Development Lab at USAID. It's a division of the agency that's a little over a year old and is actually trying to take a much more transformative approach to our overall objective to look at alleviating and ending extreme poverty. So our shtick is that we are trying to focus much more on science, technology, innovation, especially partnerships, and understanding that this is very much a network approach that needs to be taken to tackle such intractable, interconnected, and complex challenges. And I think what's interesting is, we try to look at examples around the lab rhetoric and point to things such as Bell Labs or Xerox PARC and these great kind of innovation spaces. And I would actually argue that I don't think that these are the best examples to use, because especially for the work that we're doing around development, because those places had very controlled settings, right? You were able to tinker, you were able to isolate, and you were able to block out any other challenges, where the world that we work in and within is much more complex, is much more uncertain. And in a way, I think our efforts are trying to actually even add and improve control of uncontrollable situations. So my job is I lead the program for adaptive learning and management within our technology arm of the agency and in the lab. So we use digital technologies and digital development mechanisms kind of in three overarching areas. One is digital inclusion, so this looks at content, the Alliance for Affordable Internet, initiatives like Facebook's internet.org. The second is in digital financial services, so looking at how to increase the accessibility to formal financial mechanisms. And in this regard, we're supporting the large initiative of the Indian government in their Jan Dhan Yojana campaign, which is bringing in 150 plus million underserved Indians into the formal financial space. And the third area, which I work on the most, is real-time data, and in a way that we can use digital technologies to become more adaptive within an intervention and learning through operational and transactional data, and then also connecting that towards outcome and impact data that can combine different interventions and trying to advance interoperable systems. So the majority of our work has been on the Ebola response in this regard, and actually strengthening the health information systems and kind of community resilience of the West African region. So I'll cut it off at that and look forward to questions.
Great. Thanks, Samir. Over to you, Shariha.
Thank you, Mariko. I'm Shariha, and I am part of Scope Group. We started this about 8 or 9 years ago in Malaysia, actually, because we were wanting to transform a system that we felt wasn't working. And that system that I was part of at that time was the National Health Service. But it was, of course, going to be a huge challenge to try and transform the National Health Service, being a medical doctor working within it. So I decided to leave and return to Malaysia, which is where I'm from, and tackle another health system, which I felt actually had a more urgent need, which was how do you deal with drug users who were either dying from overdoses or were contracting HIV/AIDS and spreading that to their wives, their partners, and sex workers who they visit. So we started Scope Group because of that, to respond to that challenge of how do you deal with something so complex like that, but in a way where you could actually make change happen. And of course, being a very, very small entity who was a nobody at that time, how do you influence the decision makers, coming back to your point, Christian? And this is where we decided that the best way to do this, really, perhaps, was to create a program whereby you started with the decision makers, those who are actually going to make a decision about the matter, and created a lab environment that we actually called like a pop-up lab, because it just happened wherever there was a need to do that sort of lab approach. So we started this work in Malaysia in 2006, 2007, working with the agency that handles drug users over there. But slowly, as you start, you can't just solve the problem of drug use working with only one agency. So then we brought in the Ministry of Health and all the other parties. And to be honest, we worked with them for 2 years and nothing happened, apart from the fact that they discovered what the problems were, and they started conversations through this lab approach with the communities they're trying to impact. So what actually led to them making a decision to totally transform the system was parallel work that was actually done by Pemandu. I think Pemandu is also here, around reducing crime. And that was it. That was like the trigger point, How do you reduce crime? There was an association at the time that drug users were causing crime. So then that was the trigger and the entry point for this agency to come in and have more of an influence. And we were part of the drug lab that Pemandu held as a side to the crime lab. And soon after that, suddenly everything changed within the space of 6 months because of a very strong leader. So getting the decision maker in was also important. Now, since then, this sort of approach that we've used of creating pop-up labs and working with, the social problems, but also working with the different communities that, the government is trying to impact. We've continued that type of work, but also experimenting with new ways. What if we brought in social entrepreneurs into the equation? What if we brought in NGOs and a stronger social sector, as having a stronger social sector as a parallel impact? So we've done that type of work, but now with different actors. And the most recent one that we did was actually bringing in change makers, social entrepreneurs, whatever you want to call them, innovators, social innovators from 23 countries around the world. to come to Malaysia and work very focused for 4 months, almost like, because we run an incubator accelerator as well for social entrepreneurs, so we kind of use that same model. So like an impact accelerator, 4 months in Malaysia, 44 fellows working on 9 different impact areas, 4 months. That's all you have. You have a seed fund, 10,000, go away wherever you're located and come back with solutions and early impact. And we thought, when we proposed this to the Ministry of Finance and the Prime Minister's office, they were like, are you able to do this? And we actually had doubts ourselves, but then we thought, you've got to try. I mean, the spirit of experimentation, if you trust us enough, let's do it. And we did. And we've now got 9 new social innovations, and they're going to repeat this for the next cycle. So that's, I guess, the different way that we work. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Shariha.
Yeah.
Over to you, Derek.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Derek Miller. I'm the director of the Policy Lab, not to be confused with the Policy Lab. There was a delay there. I wasn't sure you were going to get the joke. All right. We were set up in the U.S. in 2011, and I'm glad to see the British government was inspired by us. So, I was working with the UN Institute for Disarmament Research for about a decade. I'm a specialist in international security, peace and security policy, as well as development issues, and work also in humanitarian action. The Policy Lab was set up after my experience there, partly to expand the range of thematic issues we could work on, and also spun out of an event that you may not have heard of, but in 2010 there was a big event at Glen Cove Mansion in New York. Christian Basin was there, Lucy Kimball was there, Dick Buchanan was there, the Swedish government was there, Department for Peacekeeping Operations was there. Can't even remember who else was there. It was a long time ago. We spun out after that in order to bring together, it was co-hosted by by Oxford, the business school, by the University of Washington, and by the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. We intentionally brought together people specializing in cultural research, design, and public policy for the first time, in order to try to bring together a rich dialogue that could begin to move some of this forward. It's a lot of question you asked, and hopefully we'll circle around, but in the interest of time, I think I'll just end on this one point. David Halpern before said that we need to get serious with experimentation, and that's what labs have historically done, and of course he's absolutely right. But something that has not come up is we also need to get serious about theory. I know that sounds like a strange word, a boring word, but it's actually not. It's our explanation for why it is we think something works or might work. It's our explanation for how things hold together. We need, and I hear there are people with big funding powers here, that's wonderful. So you don't just need that. What we also need is an agenda. And our work together, in order to be progressive, rather than just come together year after year, share some stories, there is, and I think in the original introduction today that was expressed, there is some commonality. There is a shared vision, if not a shared set of methods yet, towards trying to improve something about our social life and our public life. And in order to do that, though, what are we trying to do? What do we need to know? And what do we need to do to learn it? And how are we going to do that as a group? Not just as an academic exercise, but rather to build some of the questions, to answer some of the key questions that we have in order to be able to make real progress in our area, not just piecemeal or on an ad hoc basis. And that's among the things we're doing at the Policy Lab, though of course we're working on very direct field level issues as well, such as the reintegration of ex-combatants in post-conflict environments, cyber stability, cybersecurity, and other public health issues with the World Health Organization and others. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks. I direct the Center for Economic Opportunity in New York City, which was founded by the then Mayor Bloomberg to focus on poverty in New York City through this innovation unit. And the methodology would be familiar to any of us who listened this morning, to develop based on existing evidence or new experimentation, new models focused on issues of poverty, whether it be through workforce development or early childhood or education, to do rigorous performance management of those models and when warranted, do RCTs. And with the theory being that those that were successful ought to be scaled up and attract greater resources. Those that didn't work should be shut down, and and resources allocated to things that work better. I joined the City of New York under the administration now of the Mayor de Blasio. And we are continuing the principles of the Center for Economic Opportunity in terms of rigor, in terms of use of evidence, focus on poverty. But we're also trying to evolve it a bit, also consistent with some of the themes that we heard this morning, from being an island focused especially on its portfolio, to thinking about embedding those principles more broadly in the way that core government works. The center was founded with $100 million in 2006. But the City of New York's annual budget is $73 billion. And there's at least $4 billion that go out in health and human services that are delivered directly by partners in the city and nonprofit organizations. So our challenge at this point is to take the principles of rigor and evidence and experimentation and make sure that it's affecting the way that the city operates system-wide when it comes to poverty and not just on our boutique, highly specialized programs.
Great, Matt, thanks very much. Thank you, everybody, for the introductions. We've talked a little bit about what you do and presumably why that works. So I'd now like to get into some of the meat, which is there are a lot of pitfalls around using lab methodologies, however we define it, to alleviate poverty. And so it would be great if you could speak to a failure specifically to illustrate the pitfalls or the challenges of using these lab methodologies. What is one really awesome, magnificent failure that your organization underwent? And can you share with the audience, with us, what you learned and what you advise coming out of that? Who would like to start?
I can share.
Please, thank you.
So one failure, I think, is that we had a case where one of the models that we funded was not successful in its intended impact. And so under the theory of the lab model in our rigorous work, we would end funding, those dollars would be reallocated. In practice, what happened is we ended the funding from Center for Economic Opportunity, but because of the stakeholders that this model had, they were able to rally funding and get from a different source of government, actually through our city council, to fund and in fact to, in New York City parlance, baseline the funding so that it would become permanent now. And so I think that highlights, well, it's a failure of how it was all supposed to work. But it also highlights the challenge to us as a field about the assumptions that we have about lab models, that funding will always follow the evidence of what works or that it, what doesn't. So just as this was a situation where funding followed something that didn't work, it's not always the case that when there is the evidence that something does work, that funding will follow that. And I think the point about leadership was very apropos, but also in the public context, we know that another important factor are the constituencies and stakeholders and advocates who will have agenda that span beyond just what an RCT might show.
Fantastic, thank you. Any other comments?
I can speak to I guess a potential failure during the course. So given that we're still quite new, there's a lot of hype around the donor community of USAID setting up this structure and a lot of rhetoric and expectations. And so what's interesting is that when you come around and you're given a good chunk of resources and a large staff, and you're saying within your organization, your mission is to transform the organization, what does that communicate to the rest of the organization? Right. So right off the bat, there is tension and contention in the creation of this. So that can be alleviated, but okay, let's get real. We're the government. We don't alleviate tension. we probably aggravate it in a lot of ways. So I think that we have this expectation to perform and to produce results. And we can have a separate discussion of outputs versus outcomes, but at the end of the day, there is this, you must do this because we are accountable to our Congress and to our government. Now, the work that we're trying to do and the work that poverty is not a short-term game, right? And you can talk about experimentation and pilots, and you can even say that we have this fashion of pilotitis and, not really collaborating and connecting amongst the community, but it all takes time. And so the challenge is to dance between saying that we want to not just have results, but we want to be effective. Because you can have results on all sorts of programs, but maybe those programs should not have started in the first place, right? Or maybe they're in the wrong location or whatever else in terms of us having a global footprint. So there is a strong potential for failure of the experiment in and of itself, of our entire kind of division. And I think that the way that we try to navigate this is to show certain types of intermediate results or certain initiatives. But it's also to acknowledge that this isn't just about us, right? And that USAID is trying to be a part of a kind of a larger community of practice and practitioners and other donors, and so that we can hopefully kind of play off one another, and we have set up several public-private partnerships and global development alliances and such. So that's a work around your question.
Great, thanks for that, Samir.
I'll
Shariha?
share next. I think maybe I'll share in the context of the work that we do, both from our own perspective as an organization, but also in the projects or programs that we've been working on. So one spectacular example from our own organization's work was related to the fact that it was the same project with the drug use and HIV/AIDS prevention. We got impatient, because I mentioned earlier, it was 2 years and we didn't see signs that things were going to change. I mean, there was amazing stuff that all these people from the front line were producing together with the community stakeholders, all these things that were designed about how the services could be better, et cetera, but nothing moved at the decision making. So we got impatient, and then we thought, well, let's use technology and try and address, HIV prevention through technology, through delivering more medicines to the drug users who were opiate dependent, who were injecting drugs. And we tried this for 1 year, and it just proved a total failure. Because we were trying to kind of shortcut getting to the end objective by bringing in technology, and it didn't work. In fact, it failed miserably. It worked for one clinic, but then not for the system. So I think patience is important. One of the biggest lessons we learned, and that you cannot see systems change happen just like that. You've really got to wait, and sometimes not doing anything after you've designed all these wonderful prototypes and tested it and all that, not doing anything is actually absolutely important. So that was one from our own learning. It cost us a lot of money. And then another one from one of the projects that we worked with was we made the assumption that the client, the agency, were ready to change. And we designed everything and put everything in place. We even did like a balanced scorecard. So there was a performance management framework even, but for doing this particular program. And we made the assumption that they understood and they were ready to change and, just run with it. But yeah, sometimes, making the wrong assumptions about the readiness for change, that can be very costly too. Because what ended up happening was they kind of lost a bit of confidence because they felt, oh, this is like too much. We don't know how to do this. We're going to look bad. And in Asia especially, looking bad or being seen as failing, you can't, right? You've always got to look good. You cannot be seen as making mistakes. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Shariha. Derek?
I think I think that cultural point is actually a good transition to this. A tremendous amount of the work that I've done over the last 10 years has been with my colleague Lisa Rudnick. And Lisa comes from a very strong background in ethnography, in particular communication of ethnography, and my background is in social research and international policy. So why does that matter? Lisa and I observed a while ago that among over 100 assessment techniques that are used in the United Nations to try to guide the development of projects, programs, or policies, not a single one paid any serious attention to cultural differences in the world. And what that means, there are 6,000 spoken languages in the world. At some point, surely that must make some kind of a difference, not just because of the languages, but because, going back to the discussion of ethnography here, and a lot of people use the term local knowledge. Some people must remember that that was actually a book written by Clifford Geertz, the same man who said, again hearkening back to something David said, this is the man who said that science can do violence to common sense, which is part of the reason why we do need to mate the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, which is why it was a fun debate, but it's a bit like asking which side of the brain you need. Anyway, so whichever side you got, I suppose. We went to Nepal. We decided that we were going to engineer a relationship between the existing methods in anthropology and ethnography in such a way that we could generate rapid but highly relevant and highly program-worthy knowledge that would be of value to the programming people within the UN system. But by the way, this could be almost any administrative system. We were in southern Nepal for this work, which is the Terai. I'm probably the only person who's been to Nepal 4 or 5 times and has never seen a mountain. It was the post-Maoist period. There were IED issues. We had radios. We had the vests. We had the the blue stuff and all that other sort of thing. It was hot. It was really hot. And the places we wanted to go to were pretty far away, and they were considered very violent, and so there were security issues, there was conflict issues, whatnot. So anyway, after working with these communities, after working very deeply with these communities for a period of time, we generated certain understandings about girls, about relationships with families for the benefit of reintegrating girls back into villages, about understanding relationships between families and the communities, about decision-making models, about a tremendous number of sort of ontological things that were highly relevant to understanding how things get done here, right? That's what it's about. As Geertz said, it's about coming to an understanding of understandings, not our own, right? Empathy, by the way, ain't gonna do it. Okay, and we can all empathize up as much as we want, but you cannot put yourself in the mindset of somebody who cuts off the arms of children, or you're a sociopath. Okay, that is what happens in the RUF. When we get down to some of this serious stuff, empathy is not a method. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to the D School, and I'm sorry to IDEO, but they're just wrong. It's not a method. It's important. But the thing is, it is not a means, not a transparent, accountable, or responsible means of generating understandings of things for which you do not have the resources to do. You have got to get systematic about it. I'm sorry to make that forceful statement, but it's on record. So the point is, we generated all this information that we knew was going to help. It was going to help children. It was going to help these communities. We brought it back to the UN capital, the UN country team, and they said, "That's fascinating. Can you give us 3 bullet points?" I said, "I can give you 50 bullet points." But the problem was this, the nature of the failure, which led to the work that we're now doing in evidence-based design, which is now published. It's on the United Nations website. It's co-authored between myself and Lisa and whatnot, and that is a direct plug for our work, for which I will not get paid more. But I really want you to download this stuff, is that what we learned was that the internal administrative mechanisms have no demand for evidence. They have no means of incorporating some of this knowledge into those systems. People are tasked, understandably so, with coming up with solutions to problems, right? And they have to do it by a certain time, within a certain budget. Somebody has to submit paperwork and has to fit into whatever the relevant administrative procedures are. In this case, it's a UN Development Assistance Framework, which can assist with poverty reduction strategy papers. None of that matters for the moment, although it's relevant to the development conversation. But the point is that it kind of harkens back, strangely enough, but there's an old Jewish proverb, which is that questions unite us and answers divide us. And I think is true. And something that I've learned is that, rather hard, is that if people don't ask questions, it's very hard to provide answers to them. So the mechanisms need to be built within those systems in order to create demand for the very knowledge that we need to design with. That is, the knowledge becomes the source material, the stuff that we use to propose actions, but also, going back to the scientific approach, to falsify our propositions for action. We think, based on what we know, this might be a good idea. But based on other things we know, we can now take it off the table. And as we were discussing in the green room before, it is wonderful, and we should all continue to try to optimize our effectiveness and optimize the solutions. But sometimes the greatest contribution we can make is actually taking the worst ideas off the table.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek. Before I open up to just maybe one question on the floor, I wish I had more time, a 5-word answer from each of you. There have been a lot of convenings around labs and a lot of books and publications and discussions. And so I'm curious to know, based on your experience in all of this, what is one issue that hasn't been talked about enough or that has been put off in the corner? 5 words from each of you, maybe 7 max. Who would like to start?
Working with the people who are going to go out and do this stuff.
Great. Thank you.
Because I think that sort of the designing and all that, all the different parties come, but then actually what happens after that?
She's
Great.
way past that.
Yes, that is. That is. But thank you for trying.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'll be 7 words, but the need for actual capacity, the danger of doing evidence or doing human-centered design weakly or badly.
Great. Thank you. Samir.
So just to build on what Shariha said, I think agency is the biggest thing, and agency for those that don't have it. So it's not just working with people, but making sure that they can work for themselves in a capacity manner.
Great. Derek, any thoughts?
I think maybe that designing is already happening in every system that we're trying to bring design to. And so we need to come up with a better understanding of the relationship of what we're trying to bring to what's already there.
Great. Thank you. I think we have 3 minutes for one question from the audience.
Nick Lansley, former Tesco Labs.
Right.
When I apply innovation, I always like to look at the end goal, and I presume that your end goal is there is no more poverty, and therefore you've somehow defined what you think poverty is, and that when people go above a certain line, they are no longer in poverty, whether it's food poverty, financial housing, whatever that is. Surely there's a bigger challenge in that those of us who are not in poverty are contributing to the problem. You're dealing with the people who are in poverty to try and bring them up. But is there not a bigger thing about trying to deal with us to bring us down, maybe, or whatever the world is, given that the world, we're using up the world 3 planet Earth's worth of resources at the moment between the population. So is your goal ever achievable? And if so, are you sometimes applying it from not from just one end when it should be applying it from more than one end? If that makes sense.
We work a lot with business, actually, like a lot with business, because we believe that business has the capacity to impact, the fact that there is poverty in this world. So that's public sector, yes, because you can achieve scale very quickly and all that, and it's important to work with government, but for sure it's equally important to work with business.
I will say there is certainly a system or a systemic lens that needs to be applied. So in the case of New York City, we are pushing very hard for an increase in the minimum wage, which is controlled by the state. But that's because we looked at the range of potential impacts of programs versus minimum wage. And if the minimum wage were raised to the amount that we want, it would move hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty, income poverty, immediately. And that's a political solution. And in political solutions, it raises some of the kinds of issues of that you're pointing to.
Jenny Winhall, I'm an independent social innovation consultant. I work for the Banff Centre and the Rockwool Foundation. Matt, I thought your example of the intervention that went off and got the funding was a really interesting one. And I wondered what your perspective is on the fact that when you bring a new intervention out into the world, it needs a lot of time to find its place in the marketplace. And of course, the experimentation that needs to happen around that means it's more difficult to measure the effectiveness of the intervention as it's rapidly adapting to its context. And so could you tell us a bit about how early you think RCTs are appropriate in that process? Or is this emphasis on measuring so early actually a problem for social ventures trying to find that market fit?
It's a problem. I think this is, and others have pointed to it, this need to demonstrate results quickly, to validate the kind of work that might be on the fringes of the systems in which we operate, puts a pressure that's maybe unnatural on the new models that we're creating. And I do think there is a tension between the validity that comes from an RCT and the need for iteration and ongoing work. I think the theory of change is a little bit flawed to say we try something, we let it simmer for a little while, we do an RCT. If it worked, then it should be everywhere, and if it didn't work, it shouldn't. Sometimes results emerge later than we measure them. Sometimes things that work in one place won't work at a different scale. And so I think our challenge is to do both. I think to the right brain, left brain is to utilize the evidence, but also build into our systems more capacity for iteration and ongoing feedback.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for your candidness, if that's the right word, and for sharing your insights. And thank you all for listening without judgment. I'm told that our time is up. If we could offer a round of applause for our panelists.